flavour.
Now, with all the latest headlines this Monday lunchtime, it's the ITV News.
Is the royal soap opera heading for a season finale? Prince Harry's book isn't out until tomorrow, but today we heard more accusations from him in a series of television interviews. He said he's not in contact with his brother and father, and we heard this on Camilla.
She was the villain. She was the third person in the marriage. She needed to rehabilitate her image.
He has accused his own family of a deafening silence. Will we hear from the palace today? I'm joined by our royal editor, Chris Shipp. Also this lunchtime. Millions to move patients from hospitals to care homes. Will the government's short-term plan to fix the social care crisis help? International condemnation after protesters stormed government buildings in Brazil. And eyes to the skies, why Newquay is set to make European space history tonight.
This is the ITV Lunchtime News with Nina Hossain.
Good afternoon. What more do we now know, and what impact could Prince Harry's latest interviews have on the monarchy? Ahead of his book publication tomorrow, the Duke of Sussex has spoken of the Queen Consort Camilla as the villain, accusing her of forging a dangerous relationship with the press to rehabilitate her own image after her affair with his father. He accused the royal family of failing to defend his wife from attacks in the press, including the recent article written by Jeremy Clarkson in The Sun, which led to an apology from the paper. We also learned he didn't deem the comments about his son's skin tone by an unnamed royal to be racist, rather an example of unconscious bias. Here's our royal editor, Chris Shipp.
90 minutes long and countless accusations, but the more than 4 million people who watched the Harry interview last night will have been left with a portrait of a prince who has had a troubled life, one which went terribly wrong when his mother was killed.
Thinking back to when I was 12 years old, sitting in that sunken bed at Balmoral Castle, I took myself back to that moment and tried to remember as much as possible. You know, my father coming in his dressing gown and sharing that news with me.
There followed many difficult years, but looking back on it all now from his home in the US, Harry explained who was to blame for him leaving the country and turning his back on the royal family.
At that time, I didn't fully understand how much or how complicit the family were in that pain and suffering that was happening to my wife. And the one group of people that could have helped or stopped this from happening were the very people that were encouraging it to happen.
But why speak up at all, Harry was asked. Why put private family matters into such a prominent public place?
They've shown absolutely no willingness to reconcile up until this point. And I'm not sure how honesty is burning bridges. You know, silence only allows the abuser to abuse, right?
What has today received a lot of attention is the issue of racism, and in particular, the chat Harry and Meghan had with Oprah Winfrey when they revealed an unnamed member of the royal family had asked about the skin colour of their baby.
And also concerns and conversations about how dark his skin might be when he's born.
What? In the Oprah interview, you accuse members of your family of racism. You don't even...
No, we didn't.
Well,
the British press said that.
Right.
Did Meghan ever mention that they were racist?
She said there were troubling comments about
there was
skin
concern
colour.
about his skin colour.
Right. Wouldn't you describe that as essentially racist?
I wouldn't, not having lived within that family.
Right.
For me, the difference is unconscious bias and racism. But if you are called out for unconscious bias, you need to make that right.
Again and again, Harry laid the blame at the door of one group, the British press.
We're talking about an antagonist which is the British press. It was something that the British press created, a distorted narrative that was being pushed through the British press.
By and large, the King, who was pictured here in Norfolk yesterday, was spared the worst criticism. He wasn't a great single father, Harry said, but his stepmother Camilla was a target of blame and accusation. She was, Harry claimed, dangerous.
She was the villain.
This is what he said about the now Queen consort in his US interview on CBS.
How was she dangerous?
Because of the need for her to rehabilitate her image.
That made her dangerous.
That made her dangerous because of the connections that she was forging within the British press. And there was open willingness on both sides to trade of information.
And Harry said he's not had a conversation with his brother or his father for some time.
Speak to William now? Do you text?
Currently, no.
Do you speak to your dad?
We haven't spoken for quite a while. No, not recently.
Harry also revealed he wasn't allowed on the family plane to Scotland on the day the Queen died, although we should be clear, other members of the family didn't get there in time either. But his grandmother did know how bad things had got, Harry told Breakfast TV in the US.
She never said to me that she was angry. I think she was sad that it had got to that point.
If reconciliation does ever happen, Harry wants any talks with his family to remain private.
What they have to say to me and what I have to say to them will be in private, and I hope it can stay that way.
You might note he said that in one of his many TV interviews with no hint of irony. Chris Ship, ITV News.
In a moment, we're going live to Chloe Keedy, who's at Buckingham Palace, with more reaction to Harry's interviews. First, lots to discuss with our royal editor, Chris Ship. First of all, what's your overview of what you've been watching in the last 24 hours?
I mean, listen, I think had the book not been put on bookshelves in Spain as it was on Thursday, a lot of what we heard last night would have been, wow, Prince William had a fight with his brother. Wow, he was knocked to the floor. Wow, look what he said about his stepmother. So therefore, you know, we know by and large what was in the book when the interview started airing yesterday. So therefore, for me, what was important is about what he would say about his content in the book, what he would say about his family, and what he would say, for example, about these, you know, allegations of racism that all stem back to that Oprah Winfrey interview. Look, I think it's quite clear that his brother is the target of a lot of criticism and that intense sibling rivalry, which is now out there in the public domain and hasn't gone away, but also this relationship with his, you know, stepmother. You know, to call his stepmother dangerous. He said at one point that bodies will be left in the street in her bid to rehabilitate her image. Doesn't really give any specific examples of how she did that. But then, you know, goes on to say that he actually quite likes seeing members of his family. I love every member of my family, he said. And when we see each other, we're perfectly pleasant to each other. Hard to see how that would be.
Back to that Oprah Winfrey interview, and what do you make of this renewed interest in what he said about this unnamed royal and the skin tone of his unborn son?
Harry is right to say that Meghan never said it was racist, and in Harry's chat with Oprah Winfrey, this is what, April 2021, he never said it was racist either. Buckingham Palace's response did contain the word race. The famous "recollections may vary" comment, but I think, you know, Harry allowed that story to run and run. And one of his criticisms of the palace is that they never corrected a narrative when it started running. For example, the whole Kate, who made who cry over the wedding, and he said the palace never corrected that. So you've got to ask, why didn't Harry correct the narrative that was running that Buckingham Palace was allegedly racist in asking about the skin tone? And, you know, he doesn't ever give us an answer to that.
Yes or no, are we likely to hear from the palace today?
Nope.
Chris Champ, thank you. Let's go live to Buckingham Palace and join Chloe Keedy. What's been the reaction there to these interviews so far, Chloe?
Well, very mixed, actually. There's been some sympathy, people saying watching the interview made them feel sad, listening to him talk about his mother's death and the impact that had on him. Other people said it made them feel sad that he feels he has to do this, that he has to share these very personal details about his life, and that, as he said, he seems to feel it's the only option open to him to set the record straight. Now, others we spoke to were less sympathetic about that, about him sharing these things again about his life, about his family's life, and felt that in doing doing that, he really hasn't done himself any favours at all.
I didn't expect the amount of vocally kind of talking about your family things that you probably could keep on your own, and it's hard to have as much sympathy, I think, just because you're like, maybe we could talk with people rather than just tell the whole world everything, all our problems.
This young man who everybody used to love and think was such a super personality and very good for the royal family, he's just become a bit of a sad case.
I was surprised at how eloquent Harry was. He has quite a large vocabulary. I think that's probably because he's had a lot of therapy, and so he talks in this weird kind of therapy language. But the problem with therapy language is it often actually doesn't make much sense. And so really, after finishing the programme, I thought Harry has confirmed his status as the nation's biggest plonker.
Well, I should say that some people we spoke to said they'd deliberately chosen not to watch because they already feel they've seen and heard enough from Harry. I'm not sure how that bodes for his book, which does, of course, go on sale tomorrow.
Chloe, thank you. Some British reaction there. Let's get some from America now and join our US correspondent Dan Rivers in California, where Harry and Meghan live. Dan, what are people there making of what they've seen so far and the book, which is out, as we've been saying, tomorrow?
Well, I think they're pretty intrigued, and I'd imagine there will be a very large audience for the US interviews as well. Good Morning America are airing theirs right now. Last night we were at a sort of viewing party in a local bar where people were also watching the CBS 60 Minutes interview with Anderson Cooper, and there were audible intakes of breath as some of those allegations were made and revelations, particularly the one where Harry said that he carried on believing his mother, Princess Diana, was alive many years after the car crash in 1997 that killed her, and sort of waiting for a phone call or for her to somehow re-emerge. I think that struck many people as being very poignant and heart-rending. In terms of the book, well, the book is released here tomorrow, as it is around the world. We've been in their local bookshop, I suppose, in Santa Barbara, asking people there whether they now would consider buying a copy of Spare.
Read it, talking about it and hearing that it's a big deal and that people are really wondering what he has to say. I think it would be cool to read it. And I know they have a Netflix show, which she's revealed a lot on there, and it's kind of how do you process knowing what they're going through, and how much do they enjoy being in the position they're in.
He's obviously got a lot of it's bothering him from what I've read in the paper. It's always secondhand, and I think it's good to get it out, but on the other hand, I think some stuff ought to be kept private.
So the Good Morning America interview, as I said, is happening now. Among those revelations, new revelations in that, is that he says he hasn't talked to the Queen Consort Camilla for a long time, although he continues to be civil to her. Of course, there's more to come. He's on the Late Show tomorrow evening as well, on the day that book is launched.
Dan Rivers, thank you very much. And you can watch Tom Bradby's interview in full on ITVX, plus for a look at the key moments, just scroll down to the news section. On to the day's other main news, and we'll start with the NHS winter crisis. Today, the government offered a solution. Ministers are to spend up to £200 million trying to move medically fit patients out of hospital and back into the community with paid-for care across England. The aim is to free up beds, but critics say it doesn't fix the social care problem and won't be enough. Our political correspondent Romney Weeks has the latest.
With junior doctors being balloted today over whether they too will go out on strike, the Prime Minister visiting a health centre in Yorkshire is under pressure to get a grip on the multiple crises facing the NHS, announcing a plan to buy up more care beds to ease the situation in hospitals.
Months ago, the government announced £500 million in extra funding to speed up the discharge of people from hospitals into their communities or back home where that makes sense. Today's announcement is even more funding to help support those initiatives. That's the right thing to do, because what it means is it frees up pressure in our hospitals. That will ease some of the burdens that we're seeing in emergency departments and ambulance waiting times.
The government will spend an extra £200 million to secure beds in care homes and other settings. There will also be £50 million to improve facilities in hospitals for those ready to be discharged. The government claims this will allow 3,000 of the estimated 13,000 patients who are waiting to be discharged to be moved initially. But care groups believe it does nothing to address the root of the problems in the sector.
It's a short-term measure driven from the state of catastrophe that we find ourselves in. It will definitely help, but it will not solve the long-term issues.
At the other side of the problem, junior Dr. Alessia Waller says voting for strike action is about patient safety as much as pay.
And there are some very scary moments where you see someone who may have been sitting in a chair for 9-10 hours, and it turns out they have a very serious medical problem that hasn't been dealt with in those 9 and 10 hours. And that didn't used to happen very frequently, and I'm finding that it happens at least a couple of times a week now.
This morning, the government met NHS and other union leaders, but hope that the government was prepared to give ground on their pay demands appear to have been premature.
Hi there, how did it go? Not well. Unfortunately, the government have missed yet another opportunity to put this right.
Yet more painful strikes in the health service are scheduled this week and next. Romilly Weeks, ITV News.
As Romilly was saying, their ministers have held a series of meetings today in a bid to try to end the strike action we are seeing across the UK. So what hope that those talks could lead to an industrial action in hospitals, on the railways being called off, and stave off a teachers' strike in schools across England. Our political correspondent Carl Dinnan joins me now from Westminster. What's the latest, Carl, on who's talking and how those talks went?
Well, it's principally the departments of education, transport and health who are involved in these talks today, and the various unions who deal with those departments. Now, in transport, negotiations have been ongoing. There hasn't been a breakthrough today, but negotiations have been continuing to inch forward, I think. On education, teachers haven't quite announced whether they're actually going to have a strike yet. They've balloted for it. But as Romilly was just indicating, it's in health where the situation seems most intractable and also where the strikes will be coming soonest. Now, in those talks, as you just heard, the Unite negotiator came out feeling very angry and saying that the government only wanted to talk about his members having to make more productivity savings in order for pay to be raised in this year, and he was furious about that and said that it actually set the whole situation in terms of the relationship between the government and the unions backwards. I have to say, other unions who were there didn't feel quite so strongly that it had gone backwards. The GMB union said afterwards there was some engagement on pay, which is new in terms of this year, but not a concrete offer. And I think what may have happened is that they are talking about the possibility of a one-off payment for this year, but that the government hasn't got commitments from the unions that it needs in order to make that yet.
Carl Dinnan, thank you very much. The Prime Minister has joined other world leaders condemning the storming of Brazil's government buildings by hundreds of supporters of Brazil's far-right former President Jair Bolsonaro. The riot yesterday was an apparent attempt to overthrow the current president by protesters who refused to accept his election victory. Aisha Tull has our report.
Thousands of supporters of ex-President Jair Bolsonaro stormed Brazil's government buildings. Draped in Brazilian flags, the rioters' attention focused on Congress and the Supreme Court. Once they broke in, they smashed glass and furniture. President Lula has vowed to punish those involved.
There is no precedent for what these people have done, but these people will be punished.
So where did these protests come from? Well, shortly after the election result, Bolsonaro supporters began gathering outside military bases in Brazil, calling on them to intervene to stop Lula from getting into office. Then they took to the streets, blocking roads and holding rallies in protest over the defeat. The Bolsonaro administration has not directly opposed the transition of power, but still hasn't conceded that he lost or congratulated his opponent. He's criticised the protests on Twitter, saying that peaceful protests were part of democracy, but destruction and invasions of public buildings were not. International condemnation has been swift. The world is now watching to see how Brazil responds to the attack on their capital. Aisha Tull, ITV News.
Finally, this lunchtime, thousands are flocking to Cornwall to witness a moment in British and European history. Tonight, bearing any technical hiccups, the UK will see its first orbital rocket launch using a repurposed Boeing 747. Martin Stew is in Newquay. What a big night ahead for the UK, Martin.
Absolutely, Nina. We could be seeing a little bit of history. If the satellites are successfully put into space, it will be a first, the first time satellites are launched from the UK into space. Behind me here we can see a mock-up of Launcher 1, which is strapped at the moment, the real thing, underneath the wing of a 747 with 9 satellites inside. What will happen is the plane will take off, climb to about 35,000 feet, and as it's just to the southwest of Ireland, it'll then drop Launcher 1, which is the length of 2 double-decker buses. That will fire up its rockets, shoot into the atmosphere, and once it's doing 17,000 miles an hour, it'll then deploy those satellites into space. A huge moment, and a moment with wide-ranging implications for the space industry in this country too.
The UK is fantastic at designing satellites. It produces more satellites than anywhere else outside of the United States, and we're great at operating them and exploiting the downstream data. What we don't have, of course, is that launch capability, and particularly as we see what we call the low Earth orbit economy taking off, we think that's great economic value that we can capture, but also it brings skills into the UK and inspires the next generation of scientists, engineers, artists, lawyers, all those people that we really need to make this space economy work in the UK.
So plenty of reasons to be excited. Around 2,000 members of the public expected here at Newquay Airport to watch from the ground. Launch is at 10:30, fingers crossed, although the wind is picking up. So all eyes on the weather for tonight's launch.
Yeah, and then all eyes on the skies. Martin, thank you very much. That's all we've got time for now. From everyone on today's Lunchtime team, bye-bye.
You may want to